This is a picture of the Ulrich Fluckiger and Anna Kaser Fluckiger family. There are 10 siblings listed. One sibling died as a child. We'll go through each of the siblings very briefly so that you become acquainted. Associate the picture and the name. Anna Maria was the oldest sibling. She immigrated to America. Anna Barbara was the next sibling. She stayed in Switzerland. Never did join the church. Anna Katharina also stayed in Switzerland. Did not join the church. Johannes, or John, joined the church. He was the first to immigrate and was a very key figure in the immigration of all of his siblings. Ulrich Jr. did not immigrate, stayed in Switzerland. He, however, financed each of them from money that he borrowed as part of their inheritance. Elizabeth joined the church, immigrated. Gottlieb, Marianne, Jacob Andrew, and Maria Elise all immigrated as well. This is a chart that shows the spouses that they married and the dates that they immigrated. Anna Maria, as we mentioned before, was the oldest child. She married a Christian Fluckiger in 1881. They had no children. She immigrated in 1899. Barbara married a Johann Gradel, stayed in Switzerland, did not join the church. Katharina married Ulrich Zander, did not join the church. And John joined the church, immigrated in 1884, married Marianne von Allman. Ulrich married Maria Schar, did not join the church, stayed in Switzerland. Elizabeth married Christian von Allman and later a Godfrey Fuhrman, immigrated in May of 1887. Rosetta died as a child. Gottlieb married Lisette Schweischer, immigrated in 1890. Marianne married Albert Frederick, immigrated September 1890. Jacob Andrew married Barbara Baumgartner, immigrated 1896. Elise married Hans J. Hammert, and later Griffith Roberts, immigrated 1890. Ulrich and Maria Fluckiger of Knüppel, Switzerland. That was the only sibling who carried on the Fluckiger name on the Swiss cousins. He had 6 children. Frida, a daughter, Frida, married a Whistler, and that's a common name on the Fluckiger Swiss cousins. Out of the 5 boys, the only one that had living descendants was Werner. Werner was the son of, was the father of Max, And Max played a very important role in the history, Fluckiger history. Max and Wally, the last Fluckiger of Ulrich's family in Switzerland, farmer owner of the Knüppel, our forefathers' home, desires to strengthen togetherness of the Fluckiger blood and a heartfelt affection for Switzerland, the homeland. He's the one that inherited the Fluckiger Bible, which is nearly 300 years old, and it is now housed in the Daughter of Utah Pioneers in Afton, Wyoming. It's featured in a very attractive display. I would encourage any of you who have an interest to make arrangements to view that and other Fluckiger artifacts that are also in that museum. Johannes Fluckiger, or John. I'll read a brief history since he's the major player in the immigration process. This paper comes from the Fluckiger family homes. This paper is an addendum to the history of John Fluckiger's early efforts to homestead in the Bedford, Wyoming community. New information became available as in the Wyoming State Archives through the efforts of Ron Watts. The original account is contained in the above document. In the original account, John gives an overview of his work experience after his arrival at Providence, Utah, from 1884 to 1887. For 2 years, I worked in the Hiram Smith Woolies Ranch on the Blackfoot River. This ranch was near Soda Springs, Idaho. The second year, I was at the Wooley Ranch in 1887. I met John Thatcher Jr. He was feeding cattle in the upper Star Valley, south of Lime Creek. It should be Lane Creek, the Tin Cup area where David and Will Coons had their dairy. John Thatcher Jr. had relatives who were involved in building a bank in Logan, Utah, known as the Thatcher Brothers Bank. Mr. Thatcher must have persuaded John to apply for work on this project because of John's carpentry skills. Apparently, this is what John did. He recorded, "And Mr. John Thatcher persuaded me in 1888 to settle at Star Valley. I looked the country over but returned to Logan as a first-class carpenter working on the Thatcher Brothers Bank." This implies he had worked there the winter of 87 and 88. John continues, "I returned to Star Valley a year later, 1889, with 2 horses and a covered wagon, planning to homestead. This is the year he lived in a dugout, at least until late fall. Family letters indicate that he was back in Logan working by late December of 1889. John built the Thatcher log cabin during the summer of 1889 from the Charles Heiner history. He also got logs out for his own cabin that he planned to build the following year on property he planned to homestead just east and adjacent to the Thatcher property. John worked the winter of 1889-1890 in Logan. He courted Mary Ann von Allman that winter, and they were married on April 2nd, 1890. Following their marriage, they came to Bedford to homestead on the property that John had previously selected. They were the first year-round settlers in the Bedford-Turneville area. According to Mary Ann, their closest neighbor was George Miller. His residence was just south of Muddy String, on the present location that Earl Kinslow now owns. This is a picture of the log cabin John Fluckiger built for John Thatcher in 1889. This shows a diagram of the way the logs are put together. They're beveled in such a way that it holds its structure. It becomes very strong in its structural aspect. Notice how the logs are tapered in such a way to hold logs in place. In the left-hand corner is a picture of John Bethiel Thatcher, who hired John to build the cabin that he built. John Fluckiger homes. These are pictures of John's homes that he built. The upper left home is the same as the home pictured just to the right of it, except that to the right it's been painted and looks much more much more visible than it is in the left. Notice to the lower left there's a little there's a building. You can see the roof and the one part of the side. I'm assuming that's the first log home that John built in 1890 to provide housing for his family. And it was a well-built home, had shingles and a board floor, which were not common in those days at that period of time. Bedford Town Home. I will refer to that later. That's a home that John built on his Bedford lot. The barn is large structurally, and I remember it briefly from when I was a child. Elizabeth Fluckiger Fuhrman. Elizabeth was the next to immigrate in 1887. Her first husband was Christian von Allman. They immigrated and went to Santa Clara, Utah. Christian died a few months later. She then went to Logan, and because of her relatives there, a relative, Godfrey Fuhrman, had her help him with his family. His wife was in ill health and had a number of children, so she helped with the housework. And so far as I know, she was provided a room in their home. In 1890, about 2 or 3 years after she had immigrated, she bought a lot there in Logan, and in 1891, her brother Gottlieb was in the Logan area. He built a home for her, and she and her sisters apparently lived in that home for a time. Later on, when she married Godfrey Fuhrman, he sold his home and moved his family into the home that Gottlieb had built. And as you look down on the right-hand side, there's the Frederick home. Albert married Mary Ann Frederick after she immigrated, and that was the home they lived in. Gottlieb immigrated in 1890, along with two of his sisters, Mary Ann Fluckiger and Lise, his sister. They arrived at the Montpelier train station. John, who of course had homesteaded in Bedford, met them at the train station, brought them to Bedford. Marianne and Elise stayed for about 2 weeks, and then he took them to Providence, where they lived with their Aunt Barbara Loosely, who had immigrated some time before. Gottlieb married Lisette Schweitzer in 1889, and we'll talk about them more at a later time. This is the homes that Gottlieb had built. The first home he built was a little log cabin, which was just a small structure, and it was used as a shop, and he lived there for a time. And then next he built the home pictured there, later on, about 1920, he built the second home in the lower right-hand corner. That's the home that I remember, and it was a nice home for those days. Now, before we move on, I'll mention over a period of time, 7 siblings immigrated to America, to the United States, and 5 of those siblings from about 1897 or 1898 until 1901 lived in the Star Valley area. These included Gottlieb, John, Andrew, Elise, and Marianne. Marianne Frederick, they and her husband Albert lived in Freedom for a time. They had a ranch there, and then in 1901 they returned to Providence, and this apparently is a picture of their family get-together prior to their departure for Providence. And each of the 5 families are represented there, with the exception of Gottlieb, who at that time was serving a mission to his homeland of Switzerland. And notice there's 2 small boys there standing in front, one on the left, one on the right. Those are the Wettstein boys. When Anna Maria immigrated in 1899, neither Gottlieb nor Andrew had much help. None of their children were old enough to be of much help. And so she brought these 2 boys whose mother had passed away. Father was not in a position to immigrate, and so he asked her if they could immigrate with her. She brought them then to Star Valley, and one of the boys lived with Gottlieb, one of the boys lived with Andrew until about 1903, at which time their father immigrated and came and picked up the boys and returned to Logan. And that was kind of a hard time for both Gottlieb and Andrew, because they depended on him to help on the farm. Now Marianne immigrated in 1890 along with Gottlieb and Elise. She went to the she and Elise, as I mentioned, were in Logan, were in Providence. They lived with their great aunt, Barbara Loosely, in her home for a time. During the time the Fredericks were here, they had a ranch in Freedom area, and these are pictures of the large haystacks that they had. And if you look closely, there's fences and cattle and there's a couple of individuals on horses. She married Albert Frederick in January of 1893. Albert Frederick's sister had married Godfrey Fierman, and she passed away, and then that's when Elizabeth married Godfrey in 1895. These are the Fierman and the Frederick homes in Logan. The upper left or upper right home is the home that apparently Gottlieb built for his sister Elizabeth, and the sisters apparently stayed together in that home for a time. And then when Godfrey married Elizabeth after his wife passed away, he sold his home and moved into the home with Elizabeth. The Frederick home was the home of Albert Frederick, his father's home. He passed away, and then they moved into the home pictured there in the lower right. Fierman apparently had a homestead near Pocatello, Idaho. Part of the family spent the summers for a time in that homestead, and then moved back to Logan during the winter. This is Anna Maria Lease. She, of course, came across in 1890 along with Gottlieb and Mary Ann, and she went to Logan. And during the time she was in Logan, she went to Salt Lake, as did her older sister Elizabeth, trained in midwifery, and then when she returned to Providence, she decided to come back to Star Valley, which she did in about 1898. Now, she married Hans Jorgen Hemmert in July of 1903, about 5 years after she came back from Logan. He was an older man. He passed away in about 1906. She, at that point, married Griffith Roberts in 1909, and helped raise a couple of boys and some other Roberts children who needed parental care. This is a picture of the home that the three brothers built for a lease. Now, backtracking just quickly, in 1894, John was called on a mission to Switzerland, to his homeland, and he returned in 1896. Just prior to his return, he baptized his younger brother, Andrew. And Andrew then immigrated with, as John returned to his home here in Bedford in 1896, and he lived with the John Fluckiger family for about a year. Also, prior to his departure for America, John also baptized his older sister, Anna Maria, who at that time remained in Switzerland. Now, at that point in time, in 1897, Jacob Andrew bought the John Thatcher homestead along with the homestead cabin. So by 1898, he was living in the cabin. The lease returned in 1898, so she moved in with Andrew and Gottlieb, who had established a homestead of his own, just had a small log cabin. So the three of them lived together there in the Thatcher cabin for a period of time. And it was a three-room building, a home. 1899, Gottlieb married Lisette Schweitzer, and then they moved into their own home. In June of 1899, Andrew married Barbara Baumgartner, and so she moved in with Andrew and Elise. Now, Elise was gone a lot of the time on various calls as she was involved in her midwife service. And so in about 1901 or thereabouts, the three brothers decided that Elise needed a home of her own. So just east and south, a little of the Thatcher homestead cabin where they were living, three brothers built a home. That home is pictured here. It's I think it's about a four-room home at that time. So for a time, they were all, she lived there alone. And then, as mentioned, she married Hans Hammond in 1903, moved to Logan, and after a period of time, Andrew bought that home from her and moved his family into that home. And this is Jacob Andrew Fluckiger, married Barbara Baumgartner, and that date is wrong. That should be June of 1899. That's an error on that date. So Jacob, with his family, lived first of all in the Thatcher homestead cabin, the three-room cabin. Somewhat later, they moved into Great Annalise's home that we had just pictured previously. And then, there's Great Annalise's home. Then in 1915, Andrew had a home built, which was a nice home for those days. And that's where they spent the remainder of their days, or at least Andrew. This again is a picture of the family from the period of 1897 to about 1901, when the 5 families lived in the valley, and all of them are represented there. On the right-hand side, you see Andrew and Barbara. Their oldest child, Herman, is probably a year or less old at that time. Anna Maria Fluckiger married a Christian Fluckiger, so as mentioned before, her married name was Anna Maria Fluckiger. They were married in 1881, prior to the time the missionaries contacted the Fluckiger family there in Switzerland. And she was baptized by John just prior to his departure for America in 1896. She didn't immigrate until 1899, and with her she brought the Wettstein boys, as previously mentioned, and she established her home in Providence. This then is a display in the Daughter of Utah Pioneers Museum in Afton of the 5 families who lived in Star Valley, 5 out of the 7 siblings that immigrated. On the upper left-hand side is John and Mary Ann von Ullman and their 7 children who all grew to maturity and had families of their own. On the right is Andrew and Barbara and their 9 living children. One child passed away as a child. And her name was Frida, and she's buried in the Bedford Cemetery. On the lower left-hand side is Great Aunt Elise. She had no living posterity. Then there's Gottlieb and Lisette. They had posterity, but none lived to maturity. Then Albert and Marianne Frederick are pictured as well. So there's the 5 families represented who all lived in Star Valley at one time or another. This is a brief map that we drew. As you look down toward the left-hand lower side, there is a picture of the town site of Bedford. And number 1 is where the church is located. That's where our family reunion was held, where we made this presentation. Across the street from the church is the old Bedford Mercantile. It's still standing. It was built in about 1906, so it would be well over 100 years old and still serves as a post office for the local community. Now look to your right just a little. There are 3 rectangular drawings. Each drawing represents 5 acres. When I showed you the picture of John's homes that he had built, at that time it was customary for some of the families to have their town lot home where they would go out in the summer on their farms and put in the crops, and then in order to make school and church and other activities more accessible, they moved into a townhome. That was the plan of the 3 brothers, evidently. And John built the townhome that was pictured, town lot home. He lived there apparently for a couple of years and then went back to the ranch or the farm. And this middle lot there is Andrew's. He never did build a home. His son Henry married Lenora. They had a two-room home built in Turnerville, moved down, placed on the lot, and that became their home then for a number of years. The very bottom lot is Gottlieb's lot, and he never built a town lot home on it. John's oldest grandson, Roy Skinner, built a home there on that lot. His daughter and son-in-law purchased it from him. They've lived there for many years. The home is still in use, and that covers the town lot homes and lots. As you go south about 1 mile from the lots we just discussed, there's a junction there where the road turns east and the one road continues south. About a half mile each way. There's about 160 acres there, and Andrew purchased that homestead from John Thatcher Jr., and that became the Andrew home site. John homesteaded the land just east of Andrew's place, and that was his homestead. Gottlieb homesteaded the land to the south of John and Andrew's, and so the three brothers had homesteads that were adjacent to each other. As you continue south and east, you go to Turnerville, where the sawmill was built in about 1890 or thereafter. Now, as you go down to the left-hand corner, lower left-hand corner, there's another 160-acre parcel of land. And in 1913, grandfather Andrew bought that 160 acres, 155 acres, from Edward Mayer. And so now he had the two places, the one that originally bought, and then the 160 acres here on what we call the West Hills. Charles Heiner, who was very influential in the early days of Bedford, whose home was in this area here, and persuaded Edward Mayer to contribute 5 acres to the Bedford community for a cemetery, which he did. And that cemetery is now, of course, on the West Hills, a very beautiful location and a well-kept cemetery. So if you have opportunity to visit that site, I think it'd be well worth your while. From that site, you can look down into the Bedford town site, and you also look to the southeast and view the three homestead sites of the three brothers. This is a picture of the home site areas of the three brothers. Now, if you notice down here on the left-hand side, there's a little pond there. That's the home site of John. His home's about there, just to the left of the pond, and the first log home he built was just a little to the right, and that's where his home site was. As you look down from the pond, there's the home, the Andrew Fluckiger home, built in 1915. And just to the right of that is a little log cabin. It's hard to see. That's the original John Thatcher home site cabin. This area here, the upper left, is upper middle, is John's homestead property. Down to the right and to the west is homestead property of Andrew, and over to the left up on the hillside there is Gottlieb's homestead. Now, you can't see the home site of Gottlieb because of this hill. There's a creek that runs down through kind of a little canyon kind of thing, and so his home site is not visible. But that's the general area of the three. This then just labels it so that it's easier to identify where the three homesteads were located.